Social Justice Goblin! Welcome to the backyard. So, now how I was talking like how Mexican wrestling, was it its own creation? Then, I came to the conclusion Japanese wrestling was inspired by American wrestling. It, and to an extent, because the Japanese, you see, as I read this book, from Jim Cornette, Rags, Papers, and Pins, he talks about how the Japanese wrestlers used, like Inoki and some of the greats, used to come to the Memphis territories and train in their early careers. And U.S. wrestlers were a huge draw in Japan. I mean, they had a different style, but it was similar enough to the U.S. style that it blended well, and it continues to blend well. I mean, because the thing is Japanese influence wasn't really changed wrestling again with the revolution that was ECW. Because the thing that changed wrestling, in my opinion, was the hardcore garbage matches. That was happening in Japan. I remember one time seeing one where they threw him in a piranha tank. I was like, whoa, piranhas. And then you find out how it works. And, and Mick Foley was doing a lot of that crazy stuff in Japan. And, I mean, but what's funny about it, though, is, and this is the part that people don't get about this garbage wrestling, it's an offshoot of Southern wrestling. And they've been doing it in Puerto Rico since the 80s, as far as I can tell. I remember seeing many magazine articles about flame barbed wire death matches. And explain to me Abdul the Butcher. I'm sorry, he has a fork. He's always been hardcore, as long as I can tell. The Shepherders were hardcore. I mean, Crimson Masks were common. It's almost like it's an extension of Southern wrestling, or Puerto Rican wrestling. Because I don't know the history of Puerto Rican wrestling. I just know Bruiser Brody was murdered in Puerto Rico, and that kind of and I know Carlos Colon and his son his son Carlito, was in the WWE. But Carlos Colon was like the top draw, and was the top draw in Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, they brought in Americans and stuff. Tony Atlas performed there, and so, but, I remember many a flaming death match, and then Abdul the Butcher. And then you'd see some of the Shepherders stuff, and they were hardcore. But, the Japanese, they took it to another level with the tables and with all the other stuff. And I think Paul Heyman saw what was coming out of Japan and incorporated it into ECW. And that was where we get the Japanese influence that created the influx of modern hardcore wrestling as we know it. Because even the WWF tried. I mean, WWE with the hardcore champion, Crash Holly, rocking around with his bag of weapons. I mean, it's where we get the 24-hour title from. It's goofy fun, They made it goofy. They didn't, and we still see the effects of tables and ladders and all that stuff, but that's been a part of wrestling. Tables and ladders have been part of wrestling since, coal miner gloves matches. They've been around forever. They just kind of fell out of fad in the WWF in the 80s and then came back. I mean, and they're still there to this day. I mean, the Hell in the Cell match between Sasha Banks and the Man, Becky Lynch, that was classic hardcore great wrestling done well. I mean, and when you see the Japanese do it, it's really well done. When it's not done really well, backyard wrestling style is not as good. Or when they try to repeat the magic that was ECW, it's like, because you look back on ECW and you go, that was like magic in a bottle. That was magic in a bottle. Because once you start hearing the back behind the scenes stuff, you're just like, really? It was lightning in a bottle. I mean, it revolutionized wrestling. And it got its influences from Mexico, and it got its influences from Japan, and it got its influences from what was going on in the independent leagues in America on the East Coast, who were getting influenced by Mexican wrestling and Japanese wrestling. Because that was entertainment. Mexican wrestling's entertaining. In Japan, it always came across as a sport. But I don't know. I haven't watched much Japanese wrestling, but what I have watched, it always comes across as a sport. Pancrea looks like fake UFC is fake UFC. But I don't know my Japanese wrestling history, so I'm not an expert in that area. But it's interesting how the Japanese wrestling, it was definitely influenced by the U.S., but I'm not sure what its origins were. It was something that probably formed after the war when the GIs would check it out and talk about it and stuff, probably, because American culture really, after the war, influenced Japanese culture heavily. So I don't know. And also the Japanese, they evolve a lot faster on their techniques, because if you look at manga, they've really evolved their manga. We pale in comparison to the stuff you saw in the 60s and 70s in manga. So it's an interesting quandary figuring out the Japanese puzzle, and I need to do more research in that subject matter, and that means watching tape, and it's like, I hate watching Japanese wrestling because everything's in Japanese, so I don't understand. It's like watching Mexican wrestling, everything's in Spanish, and I'm like, okay, he looks like he's bad news. I'm not sure what his promo work is. He looks cool. Conan looks friggin' like a beast. He looks like someone you do not want to meet in a dark alley. And yet in the WCW, they didn't let him do that. Where in ECW, they went and got the guys that really could do Crazy 8 and guys that were just incredible Mexican wrestlers. And and they brought the Mexican wrestlers, particularly Eddie Guerrero, who, one of the most famous wrestling memory, Eddie. Eddie was amazing. And it's funny when you see 1980 wrestling and you see his brother Chavo, and just what they did with Chavo, it was just, it was so culturally inappropriate. Oh my God, wrestling and cultural inappropriation has a long history of it. Bobby McDaniels. Jay Young Strongbow. Come on, the guy came out with a friggin' Indian dress head. I'm like, no. And it's interesting to see the influences in wrestling, and to see the magna opus that was the lightning in the bottle that was ECW. It was magic. It was magic in a bottle. Those guys were high, drunk, and crazed out of their minds, just trying to throw whatever could stick, and Paul Heyman was just coming up with a vision that changed wrestling as we know it.